Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and our topic today is the case of a defendant who says, "No, I don't owe you 100 zuz. I only owe you 50." That is known as moda במקצת הטענה היא שווה, or moda במקצת הטענה תשווה, a person who admits to part of the claim of the plaintiff has to take a shevuah, has to take an oath in order to not have to pay the full claim. Now, I find this to be very interesting. It comes up in Shevuot, Mem Bet Amud Bet, also shows up in Gimel Amud Aleph and Gimel Amud Bet and Bava Metzia. I find it really interesting because uh, it's this strange mix of trust and suspicion. Because on the one hand, we trust them enough that they only have to pay 50, but on the other hand, they can't do that without taking a shvuah, which is very serious. They have to take a Sefer Torah or tefillin and use Hashem's name. So we both trust them and mistrust them. On the other hand, if somebody said, "I don't owe you anything," there is no shvuah min haTorah. D'Rabbanan, we say that there's a shvuah, but min haTorah, there is no shvuah, and we just believe them. So what a strange kind of in between category this is. I also want to point out, Moda Mixatatana Yishava is strange because we have a concept known as migo, and the concept of migo is if I could have made a better defense myself, and I chose to give a defense that actually somewhat incriminates me, I should be believed. So why, in the case of Moda Mixatatana, do I have to take a shvuah? Why am I not just believed as amigo? I could have said, "I don't owe you anything." I chose to say, "I owe you 50." So I want to think a little bit about this philosophical question, not just the legal question, but the philosophical question of what does it open up for you to have a partial admission to what people are claiming of you? So let's take a look at our Gemara in uh, Shevuot first. Okay, so this is sort of the famous Ta'amar Rabba, Rabba says, "Mipnei ma'amar Torah muda b'miktzat ishava." Why do we have a biblical shvuah for a case of moda or moda b'miktzat? Chazaka ein adam me'ez panav b'fnei ba'al chovo. There is a presumption that a person would never, in front of the person who lent them money, say, "I owe you nothing." They wouldn't be that brazen. V'hai b'chulei b'ay dil chaprei. And the truth is, this person wanted to deny everything. And the fact that the defendant didn't deny owing a penny, mishum de'enu me'iz panav bifnei ba'al chavo. It's because they wouldn't do such a thing, meaning there was no real option to say, "I owe you nothing." But what about the fact that they don't say they owe everything? Ubekule bai delo delay. And the truth is, the defendant really does want to admit owing 100 zuz rather than just 50. V'hai delo odile. And the fact that the defendant doesn't admit that, ishtamute hu dekam ishtamit mide, what's happening is the defendant is just trying to buy time. Savar ad dahavi lizuze ufaranale. When I have the rest of the money, that's when I'll pay back. V'rachmana amar rami shvuah alvei. And the Torah says, you know what? Make that defendant take a shvuah, ki heicha delo delay b'chulei, because that will encourage slash pressure the defendant to actually admit if they really owe 100. So it is this weird case, and it sounds like the logic is as simple as this. When I admit part of what I owe, I am both suspected that there's more out there that I owe, but I also am trusted that I'm not a liar and I'm not going to take a false oath. It seems like that's the logic of Modeh b'miktzat hatana. The only reason why they can even have me take that oath min haTorah is because I am believed not to be a liar, right? So my hoda in some ways actually does make me more trustworthy, but it also opens up that it's possible that I'm not telling the truth, but not because I'm a liar, but because I'm just trying to buy myself time. And what the shvuah is going to do is it's going to encourage me not to make justifications like that to myself and instead to just be totally honest. So it seems like really Moda b'miktzat hatana yishava is very much about the status of the nitba or the nitba'at, the status of the defendant. However, something strange happens because when you look at the parallel sugya in Bava Metzia, you find something, a different case where it seems like Moda b'miktzat is being used, but it's not the nitba or nitba'at, it's not the defendant who's actually admitted anything. In fact, they were forced into it. Take a look. The Gemara in Bava Metzia Gimel Amud Aleph, Tani Rabbi Chia said, Maneli biyadcha, here's the case. Somebody says, you owe me 100 zuz. V'hala omer, and the defendant says, Ein lecha biyadi klum, you have nothing on me. I don't owe you a thing. Meaning, she's koferet bakol, or he's kofer bakol. They deny having anything, right? But what happens? V'ha'idim me'idim oto sheyesh lo 50 zuz. And then along come witnesses who say, actually, the defendant owes you 50 zuz. Now, this is not a case where the defendant admitted anything. This is a case where new evidence was presented by Adim. And look at what happens. Rabbi Chia says, Noten lo 50 zuz, the defendant pays those 50, but also V'yishava al hashar, has to take a shvuah. Now, you can't tell me that this is about me as a defendant showing that I'm trustworthy enough to take a shvuah, but I'm not trustworthy enough to think that I'm not making some justification to myself because I'm not the person who made the admission. This is simply a situation where there is a partial claim, right? There's a partial claim. So the Gemara explains why should this be? Shelo tehe hodat piv gedola mehadat edim mikal v'chomer. Now, is this Rabbi Chia's original or is this the Gemara explaining it? But the explanation offered is because we don't want a person's own admission. Had I admitted that I owed 50 zuz, I would have to take a shvuah. There's no reason why my own admission should be stronger, more powerful in terms of making me take a biblical shvuah than the testimony of two witnesses based on a kal v'chomer. Now, this is very interesting because that doesn't seem to have the logic of Moda b'miktzat hatana yishava, that it's about me, because they're using it in a situation even when there is no hoda. So another classical way to understand how we might interpret Moda b'miktzat hatana yishava is that it's actually not about the status of the nitba'at, the status of the defendant. It's actually about the status of the ta'ana, of the claim that was made by the plaintiff. As soon as I admit that I owe some of that money, that claim that the plaintiff had made that I owe 100 zuz is now very strong. It's gotten stronger. It's stronger than zero. And once it's gotten stronger, it can be mechayev me. It can require more of me as the defendant. I now have to take a shvuah. Same logic applies if the plaintiff says I owe them 100, and even though I say I owe 0, two Adim show up and say, we know she owes 50. Once those Adim come around, what they've done is they have strengthened the ta'ana of the plaintiff. They have strengthened the claim of the plaintiff. And the strength of the claim of the plaintiff is now what requires a biblical shvuah. Now, I want to think a little bit about the logic, the philosophy behind these two ways of thinking. One way of thinking is that when I make a partial admission to something, what I'm basically showing myself to be is someone who is not, incredibly brazen, but I also may easily be validating not telling the whole truth. I may be justifying that to myself. And I think philosophically, there's something really interesting about that. When you think about, I come in here and I say, who broke this lamp? And somebody who's in the room said, well, I didn't break it, but I don't know, I bumped into the desk and it fell, right? I understand it's not linear, but the idea of somebody admitting something, right? I understand why I might believe them a little bit more. And at the same time, I kind of understand why I might say, well, maybe you're just saying it as you bumped into the lamp because you really did break it and you were a little bit more negligent than you want to admit. You're not a liar, but you're something in between, right? Or on the other hand, if it's about the claim and I walk in and I say, you broke my lamp, and you say to me, no, I didn't. And then somebody says, well, she bumped into it. Or you admit to me you bumped into it. It's less about me believing you or not believing me. And it's more me saying, see, somebody broke my lamp. And we don't know exactly what happened, but these people were here and this was part of it. So I think philosophically, there's something interesting to consider here. Now, I want to say that these two things stand in stark contrast, I would say, with a different version of events where it might not be about the defendant and whether they're believable, and it might not be about the claim and how believable it is, but it might actually be a third kind of case. And the third kind of case is actually brought by the Rambam in the Laws of Xila and Avida, chapter 4, Halakha 16. He says this is a situation where a single witness saw me, the defendant, grab some money. Okay. And what happens is Amar HaChotef, the person who grabbed the money, that's me, the defendant, Esrim Chatafti, I took 20 zuz, the Esrim Shalihin, but they're my 20 zuz. Yes, this witness, this single witness saw me take money, and I'm telling you, it was 20 and it was mine. V'hanigzal omer, and the plaintiff says, Mea chataf. No, this person, the defendant, stole 100. Ho'il ve'ein ha'ed yodea minyanan, because the single witness doesn't know how much money was taken. Harei mishalem ha'esrim shehoda bahen shechatafan. What happens is the defendant pays the 20. Now, I want to just point out here, and the Rambam quotes, Vinishba shvuat Torah al hashar, and they have to take a shvua like a moda b'miktzat on the rest, sharei nitchayev b'miktzat, because they have become required to pay part of it. And then the Rambam says, but that doesn't sit right with me. V'dati noteh bazeh, and I actually think sheyishava hesed. It should only be a rabbinic shvua. It shouldn't be a biblical shvua of moda b'miktzat. Sharei lo hoda b'klum, because there was no admission of anything. Ela amar sheli chatafti. The person said, I grabbed my $20 bill, right? There was no actual admission. And here, what you might say is that what we're looking at is a case of Beit Din, in a way, has generated the requirement, right? Beit Din has generated the requirement, and the Rambam does not think that you should have a biblical shvua here. And that may be different from a situation where I admitted something and it's on me and my trustworthiness, or I admitted something, or even Adam came and said something which strengthens your claim. This may be a situation where it's actually just the psak of the Beit Din, it's just the ruling of the Beit Din that creates this chiyuv, this requirement, and that is not actually going to um, give cause for me to take a biblical shvua. And some people actually interpret this as that's because when the Beit Din makes a psak, what they're doing is they're actually cutting the ties between these two people, essentially saying, look, 20 and that's it. The rest of it is done because it's Beit Din themselves who are creating even the 20. Right? So that would be a totally different situation. But I want to go back for a second to our two different types of logic because it really is possible that what we're looking at here is two different approaches, one of Rabbi Chia, known as Rabbi Chia Kamaita, the first version of Rabbi Chia in Bag Metzia, where it seems to be about is the claim strengthened, and the other is the citation of Rabbah, that what we're looking at is it's all about the defendant. And I want to go a little bit deeper into that because there is actually a Yerushalmi here in Bava Kama that pits Rabbi Chia not against Rabbah, but pits Rabbi Chia against Rabbi Yochanan. And it goes like this. It's Yerushalmi and Bava Kama. Tani, Adam Amar Shamar L'Chavero, if somebody said to a defendant, Tainli manesh ata chayavli, give me the 100 zuz that you owe me. Amar lo hayu dvar me'olam. And the person said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Halach vehivi edim shechayav lo nun zuz. Then the plaintiff goes off and gets two witnesses that say, you owe me 50 zuz. Rabbi Chia Rabba Amar, so Rabbi Chia says, Hodayat edim kahodayat piv v'shava al hashar. The admission of the edim, and it's interesting language, the admission of the edim, rather than the ha'ada, the witnesses, the testimony of the edim, is similar to the admission from the defendant themselves, and they have to take a shvua on the rest. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Amar ein hodayat edim kahodayat piv sheishava lashar. Rabbi Yochanan says, I don't think that the admission, quote unquote, of the edim, of the witnesses, is like the admission, the literal admission of the defendant. And it's interesting, the question of whether, edim coming and saying this person owes 50 zuz is actually more similar to a person admitting it themselves than, say, a different situation like the plaintiff finds a contract that says that I owe those 50 zuz, right? Is there something about the fact that the edim are speaking? Is the Yerushalmi not accidentally using the term hodaya, the term admission about the edim? And Rav Yisrael Gustman in his Kuntrusei Shiurim, and it's just interesting always to mention, the legacy of a Nitzol Shoah, of a Holocaust survivor. He apparently was the final Dayan in Vilna, and he survived the Holocaust. And in his Contra Shiurim, he writes, "Vasher muchrach mizel lomar." You'd have to say, "D'zo halakha miyuchedet be'edim." There must be something unique about witnesses. Dimasha edim me'idin. The fact that the witnesses say you owe 50. Nechshav ki'ilu habal din atzmo yodea vehoda. It's thought of as if the defendant actually really knows and admitted it. Even though the defendant is claiming, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And I think that's another interesting concept, the idea of like what happens when it's just between me and you say I did it, and I say I only did part of it. And then two other people, or excuse me, you say I did, and I say I didn't do it. And then two other people show up and say, come on, you did it. We know that you did it. What do they add to kind of the discourse that's going on that's different from just sort of finding a piece of evidence that's written? And I'm not totally sure that this is always significant, but there's something to discourse and everybody talking and the Adim talking as opposed to finding kind of a static shtar. Okay. So just to kind of put it in the hopper to think about. But there is one last problem here, right? Which is we do have a concept in Jewish law where presumably if you make a partial admission of your own accord and you could have had a better ta'ana yourself, a better claim yourself that would have gotten you out of everything, then we believe you. It's called migo, right? So I want to look for a minute as a way of ending. I want to look and say, well, why is it that in the case of moda b'miktzat hatana, we make them take a shvua, but in the case, a regular migo case, we wouldn't? So the Tosfot essentially answer by saying Amigo only works when you actually had a possibility of making the better defense for yourself. But because we say Ein Adam Me'is Panav Bifnei Bal Chovo, because we say a person would never deny owing anything to their creditor if they're lying, there really was no migo here. There really was no possibility of having a better defense because nobody would actually make that defense. And I think that's also philosophically significant. The idea of, hey, everybody has standards. We can't just say there's always a better thing you could say not to admit what you did wrong, because at some point you may not have been able to say something more because it's so brazen to deny anything and to deny any wrongdoing that you wouldn't really do that. And so you've been forced into this situation of the partial truth because there's no way you were going to completely lie here, right? That would go against human nature. So I think that's another kind of philosophical dimension. And lastly, I'll say that the Rimigash, rather famously in the on the Gemara in Shevuot, Daf Mem Hamad Bet, he actually says, "Nah, we don't really have a conflict between Migo and Moda Mikzat because in a Migo case, we also make you take a shvuah." Right? Meaning what Migo does is it makes you not have to pay money, but you still have to take a shvuah, which basically means, look, bottom line, anytime somebody accuses you of the whole thing and you say, I did part of it, on the one hand, we trust you, but on the other hand, we're also wondering if you're trying to justify, you know, telling part of the truth, but not the whole truth. And we may be trying to suss that out and move away from the justifications into having as much integrity as you can. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.